Okay, so to continue, that's why the memory criterion is troubling. Um, on the one hand, there are lots of things we can't remember that we still think are us. And on the other hand, the things that we feel like we can remember, we're actually constructing to a large degree. Okay, second version of the mental identity criterion is what we can think of as the similarity criterion. So perhaps the contents of our mind change over time, but as long as we have a similar mind in the sense that we have similar kinds of emotions and similar kinds of dispositions and react similarly over time, we will count as the same person. Now, one question here is how similar is similar, but we'll shelve that for now. Part of the problem with this version is that, in fact, our experiences and feelings can change really radically and we can still be us, right? So, for example, if something suddenly happens which makes us have whole different sets of feelings and thoughts and experiences than we're used to having, we don't immediately say, oh, I'm not me anymore. What we say instead is, wow, this is me having dramatically new thoughts and feelings and experiences. We need room for the self to be able to experience things that are really new, right? Some of us are experiencing things that are really new right now, to be frank. Also, people can undergo major changes in their mental orientation. So people become very religious or cease to be very religious, have conversion experiences of various sorts, or they radically change their values. And sometimes those things feel like changes in the self, but sometimes not. Sometimes they feel like just, let me say that differently. Sometimes those things feel like changes to a whole new self, but at other times we feel like they're changes in the self. So similarity is troubling because it doesn't seem to be required for selfhood. Also, the other way around, you might have two people who have very similar thoughts and feelings and experiences, like, for example, identical twins raised in the same house, and we still want to say that they are two different selves and not one self. Bojack definitely plays with issues around this similarity criterion. He wants to know whether he's different enough now on the inside to count as a different person and whether that is enough to make him into a different person. Okay, so there's troubles with the memory and the similarity criterion. Maria Scheckman introduces a slightly more sophisticated version of the mental criterion, which she calls the self-conception criterion. Right? The idea here is this. When you experience something, you don't just experience it at that moment. You experience it in a way that is shaped and conditioned by your understanding and experience of what counts as your own past and your own future. So she gives a really nice example to do with poverty. She says if you experience poverty while you're a graduate student, and you know that that poverty is probably temporary and that you're going to get a pretty good professional job at the other end, and you know when it's going to end, your experience of poverty is going to be very different from the experience of somebody who is looking towards a future where there's no end of that poverty in sight and no change in state. And even if your poverty is exactly the same in terms of its day-to-day effects, in terms of how hard it is for you to pay rent and how much money you have for food and that sort of thing, how you experience that is going to be shaped in deep ways by your sense of your past and your future. And what she wants to say is you count as the same person insofar as that person is brought under your self-conception of somebody with a past and a future, right? So if it wasn't you who was going to graduate and get the good job, but somebody else, then that wouldn't change your experience of poverty now. It's because we see that future self as part of us under our self-conception that it shapes the present. So for her, what makes you the same person is that you are the person who is brought mentally under this temporally extended sense of self that goes from the past into the future. Here's a quote from her. She says, "My view suggests that only that when a person feels his present disappointment more profoundly because it comes at the end of a long string of disappointments, or when a shadow is cast over a person's eating and drinking pleasure by her guilt at not keeping her resolutions and her awareness that she will regret it in the morning, the past and the future are providing the context within which the present is experienced and conditions the nature of that experience. This then is the sketch of the view alternative to the qualitative similarity view, that's the one we just looked at, offered by psychological continuity theorists. It places the limits of the person at the limits of the self-conception. Okay, so, by this standard, I think this is the version that's probably most friendly to Bojack's aims. By this standard, maybe he's really not the same person because he doesn't identify with his own past, or he really doesn't want to see that as part of what conditions his present. One worry about the self-conception view is that it seems like it's too much a matter of will, right? You can just decide to disown your past or disown your future and not bring it under your self-conception. Now, maybe you don't totally have voluntarily control over that. It doesn't seem to me like I can just say, oh, that person in high school, yeah, I don't identify with that person anymore, and just cut it off. But it does still seem like on this view, if you believe yourself to be a different person than you were in the past, then you just are. And the problem with that is it risks letting people off the hook for things they should be accountable for, right? We want to know if Bojack is really accountable for Sarah Lynn's death, present Bojack, if he is really the same person. And it's not very satisfying to say, well, if he doesn't bring that past self under his self-conception, then he's off the hook for accountability. And we don't want to say, well, you're the same person and you're stuck with the same self-conception for all of the acts you're accountable for, because that's question begging and circular. What we're trying to do is figure out which events you're accountable for. So we can't just modify the self-conception criterion and say, oh, you're not allowed to disown stuff you're accountable for. We want to know what you're accountable for. So the self-conception view is more promising, but still has some worries. And that brings us to the next account, which is not a mental continuity account at all. So we talked about physical continuity, mental continuity. Now we're going to talk about a whole different kind of account, which I'm going to call narrative continuity. Right? This is the idea that your personal identity is ultimately a narrative identity, which is to say, a self that is extended over time and has a past and future has a life that fits together into a kind of a narrative or a story that makes sense. The events in it are connected to other events. The motives and plans that you make are connected to the things that you do in interpretable ways. And this is the view that you count as the same person if, in effect, you are the same character in your own narrative, right? You are the one who moves through the story of your life, whose actions are connected to your plans, and for whom the consequences of your actions affect your narrative, and so forth. This narrative theory of identity is, I think, a really crucial one in the show. It's probably the theory of identity that the show as a whole explores most. I think we can argue that rehab for Bojack is a kind of a rupture in his narrative. It's a break in his story. It takes him out of his past story and starts a new one. And if it really does rupture his narrative, then we could argue that it turns him into a different self, right? But I think it's an open question, and the show, as always, does not resolve this question for us. It wants us to think about this question and let it sit there as a tension, not so much answer it. Is rehab and this new sober version of Bojack, is this a part of his story? Is this a story about how he evolved and changed? Or is it a break in his story and a move to a new story, right? He wants to understand it as a break in his story and a move to a new story. But the fact that towards the very end of the season, he has a relapse and a fall, right? That Angela makes him, well, that's not really a fair way of putting it, but through his interaction with Angela, and through her encouragement, he ends up relapsing and drinking again. That makes it seem like the whole sober part of his story is just part of his narrative, right? There's an arc where he starts out an addict, and then he gets sober for a while, and then he relapses, in which case his sober period really is him if it's part of his story. We don't know which of these is true. One of the things that Angela does to him, which is most hateful, is she tells him specifically that the drunk version of him is the real version, and that this sober period is just a temporary part of his narrative. And this is part of what encourages him to relapse, right? But again, so we have these two possibilities. One possibility is that this is a story that includes as part of its arc Bojack getting sober and then ceasing to be sober. And another possibility is that him entering rehab creates a rupture in the narrative form of his life, which really creates a new self. And he really doesn't know which of those is right. He wants the second one to be right, but he's not sure. We don't get any truth of the matter. Well, here's an important point about narrative identity. Narratives unfold over time, and you don't know how they end until they're over. So if our identity is our narrative identity, if who we are is characters in our own story, then we really can't answer the question of which parts of us are part of the same self and which self we are, which character we are until the narrative ends, right? Because the narrative might always take a surprising turn, and we don't know if it's going to make sense as a single narrative or how it's going to make sense until it's over, which is an interesting existential feature of identity if it's true. Okay, I'm going to keep talking about this after a pause.